everyone, we're Group 1 and today we are going to share our presentation on Proxemics. My name's Molly.
My name's Nicole.
I'm Bill.
I'm Julia.
I'm Catherine.
In this experiment, we are going to focus on proxemics, specifically the response of participants when the experimenter invades their personal space. I know it's been quite some time since we've discussed proxemics in class, so here's a little refresher. Proxemics is defined as the interrelated observation and theories of man's use of space as a specialized elaboration of culture, according to E.T. Hall. In simplistic terms, proxemics is the study of space, and the idea of how space affects an individual is largely based on culture. When talking about proxemics, it's important to have an understanding of spatial barriers and what they can mean. So here's a visual interpretation of the way a participant may stand during the experiment, and we will definitely look for those stances when conducting the experiment to try and catch any indication of discomfort. So segueing into the experiment, we will test and compare the response of participants when the experimenter violates their spatial barriers with a few influencing factors. So we're going to be looking at a male who's dressed casually as well as a female who's dressed casually, a male who's dressed in business professional attire, and a female who's dressed in business professional attire.
So in male interactions in this experiment, there's a societal expectation of space, more so with males than with females. Like Tennis and Daves found in 1975, males usually prefer greater distances than females when interacting with one another. Also, Madden in 1999 found that females were more comfortable with a spatial violation by a male researcher than anyone else. Another interesting thing we found when we're talking about male interactions, that means both male as the researcher and the male subjects, is that females allowed people to get closer to their sides than their fronts, whereas males allowed people to get closer to their fronts than their sides, and that males were allowed to approach both males and females more closely off-center to the left than were females, which is interesting. And we know that the spatial violations and consequences of violating the space is totally dependent on your power in the situation and also your perceived attractiveness.
According to our textbook, research conducted by Dabbs and Stokes reflected that women that are of a lower status are more easily approachable than women of a higher status. In our experiment, we are going to be treating our casually dressed woman as if she is a woman of low status and our formally dressed woman as if she is a woman of higher status. In addition to this, research conducted by Tennis and Dabbs in 1975 reflected that females allow for shorter personal space distances than males do. As far as attractiveness goes, studies have shown that the more attractive an invader is, the more likely that someone is going to allow a personal space invasion to occur. In our experiment, we are going to be observing the expectancy violations model, which suggests that people of higher status, better appearance, or someone that can provide some type of good will more likely be able to approach someone more closely. We are going to treat our formally dressed woman as if she is someone of this higher status or better appearance, and we are going to treat our casually dressed woman as if she is a woman of lower status.
For the purposes of our experiment, reactions to the experiment can be either perceived as positive or negative. Defensive behavior is the most natural and instinctive, but positive reactions can occur when there is a reward scene. In the case of our experiment, we would expect a more positive reaction when our experimenters are dressed well and smell pleasant.
In our experiment, there are extraneous factors that need to be taken into consideration that could have influenced the experiment. We have very little control over certain factors in our territory and our environment that influence the reactions of the participants. Some aspects of the environment that have had the strongest influence on the results include the time of day of the experiment, the culture of the participant, the busy location at the rights union, the weather, temperature, and humidity, and the lighting of the room. In order to create a better atmosphere of communication, we could have done the experiment in a less chaotic environment where people were not in a rush. Since the experiment itself forces us to invade others' personal space, the atmosphere of communication is already lowered significantly. Finally, the status of the participant may have influenced the reactions of the experiment, especially when the experimentees were dressed in casual attire versus formal attire.
So now it's time to talk about our data. For the male casual interaction, we asked, did you notice me approaching you closely? 100% of males and 100% of females said yes. Maybe it was the shirt, maybe it was the socks. We also asked them, did you feel uncomfortable? Once again, they all said yes. So from this, we know that both males and females noticed me approaching them closely and felt at least slightly uncomfortable during our interaction.
For the male data for formal interaction, we asked, did you notice me approaching you closely? 100% of males said yes, and 0% of the females said yes. For asking them, did you feel uncomfortable, 100% of males said yes, and 0% of females said yes. For this, males noticed Bill approaching them closely, but females did not. Males felt uncomfortable when Bill approached them, but females did not.
For our female casual interaction, when participants were asked the question, did you notice me approaching you closely? 100% of males and females both answered yes. But when they were asked the question, did you feel uncomfortable? No males or females answered yes. The results of this show that both males and females noticed me approaching them closely, but none of them felt uncomfortable during the interaction.
In the female formal interaction, when participants were asked, did you notice me approaching you closely, 100% of males and females answered yes. When asked, did you feel uncomfortable, 0% of males answered yes, and 50% of females answered yes. From this, we can see that both males and females noticed Molly approaching them closely, but only one female felt slightly uncomfortable during the interaction.
For a participant demographic, 4 out of the 16 participants were Asian, half of them were Caucasian, 3 out of 16 were African American, and 1 participant was of Native American descent. We asked the participant this to refrain from any assumptions recorded in our data. In terms of age, 3 participants were 22 years old, 6 were 21, 3 were 19, 3 were 18, and 1 participant was 17.
For the description of subcodes, we indirectly addressed these points earlier, but touch, space, physical appearance, gesture, and covert body/temporal communication, which are nonverbal issues that are not seen or heard, are some of the subcodes that we've observed. These subcodes represent how we communicate through space and territory, taking into account our physical appearance, attire, voice, and so on. For the display of cognitive information, personal space seems to be attributable to the need to protect our body's territory, also known as the body buffer zone, which implies the physiological need for personal space.
For the display of affective information, participants' movement away from the experimenter, or any gestures displayed in the sociofugal-sociopedal axis talked about before, was used to analyze participants' levels of discomfort along with other cues, which we noted. For the display of deception, there was a female participant who interacted with Bill when he was in his casual attire. She showed clear signs of discomfort, and when she was asked if she felt uncomfortable, she proceeded to say no. That was the only identified observation of deception that we encountered, but the participant was not aware of the deception cues that she displayed.
Expectations versus results. To do this, we took that angle of the interactants in relation to the experimenter into account because we agreed it was another indicator of discomfort. We also, when we looked at this, we took into account what the experimenters personally felt, what the interactant said, and then also what the people recording thought. So we expected the females are going to allow both male and female experimenters to get closer. That's because there's this societal expectation that females shouldn't have as much personal space. We also expected that males will allow the female experimenter to get closer than the male. That's also because of what Tennis and Daves found, that males prefer greater distances when they're interacting with other males. And then lastly, we expected that attractiveness and status were going to affect how close you let someone get. And that means like if someone was perceived as more attractive, or in our formal dress when we were perceived as higher status, people were going to allow us to get closer. And what we found is that the cultural differences impacted the conscious and unconscious feelings of uncomfortability. Particularly in the formal experiment, we had one female participant who said that this she was part of Latin American culture, and that if anything, we could have gotten closer. Also, and at the same time, we had someone who was of North American, European ethnicity, and she looked obviously uncomfortable and was clearly backing up, and she didn't notice. And so unconsciously, she was very uncomfortable, and that's evidence, but consciously, she said she didn't notice. We also noticed there was a major credibility difference between formal and informal dress conditions. Formal dress conditions, it really wasn't hard to get somebody's attention, to ask them where the printing lab was, and to get them to give us the time of day to allow us to do the experiment where we needed to get closer to them. Informal, it was like pulling teeth to try and let someone get close to us. Most people just either told us where it was, or they didn't know, or they just kept moving.
In conclusion, our experiment results were different from what we anticipated. According to our research, the expectancy violation model tells us that the female in formal dress would be allowed to have the least amount of space between herself and the participant. However, our findings confirm what was found in the Madden study from 1999, in which the male researcher was allowed less space between himself and the female participant. This was true for Bill, who found that the female participants felt less violated and allowed less space between them. In formal wear, Molly seemed to intimidate female participants as they were uncomfortable with the spatial violations, which was unexpected.
Molly's interaction, both casually and formally with males, allowed for little space and no discomfort. The most discomfort and greatest amount of space allowed was between Bill and the male participants, which confirmed our expectations. In our female participants, we noticed that they were much more open to having their space invaded and were less likely to turn or back away. Overall, the reactions of the female and male participants varied based on the attire of the experimenter, the gender of the experimenter, and other extraneous factors mentioned previously.
Here's a few of the articles, journals, and texts that we referred to introduce and support our findings.